For 520 days, he slept alone. Every single night, the same four walls, the same suffocating silence, the same unbearable emptiness. But on night 521, everything changed when a tiny, desperate creature showed up at his door and refused to ever leave him again. This is the story of how one man's loneliness became the greatest love of his life, and why what happens next will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about survival, connection, and what it truly means to choose someone. Marcus Webb was a man who had everything, and I mean everything. A thriving career in tech that had made him obscenely wealthy by his early 30s. A penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline. The kind of place that made people gasp when they walked in. Friends who called him constantly, investors who wanted to back his ideas, colleagues who envied him, women who wanted to be with him. A life that looked absolutely, undeniably perfect from the outside. The kind of life that people dream about, the kind of life that magazines write about, the kind of life that makes everyone else feel like they're failing. But here's the thing about perfection. It's a cage, a beautiful, golden, gleaming cage. And one day, without any warning, without any explanation, without any goodbye, Marcus Webb simply walked away from it all. Nobody saw it coming. Not his business partners, not his friends, not his family. One week he was closing million-dollar deals in boardrooms, his name being thrown around in tech circles as the next big thing. The next week, he was gone. Completely gone. His phone went silent. His emails stopped coming. His apartment sat empty, collecting dust, like a tomb. His friends tried calling, texting, showing up at his door with concerned looks on their faces. But Marcus had already vanished like smoke. Like he'd never existed at all. The thing about disappearing is that nobody can actually stop you if you're determined enough. There's no law against it. No force strong enough to keep you tethered to a life you no longer want. He didn't leave a note explaining himself. He didn't sit down with anyone and have a heart-to-heart conversation about his feelings. He didn't say goodbye. He just left. Packed a bag, got in his car, and drove north. Drove past the suburbs, drove past the towns, drove past civilization itself. Deeper and deeper into the wilderness until the world behind him felt like a dream he'd once had. He found an old cabin in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place that doesn't appear on maps, that you only find if you're not looking for it. Isolated, forgotten, perfect. He bought it with cash from a real estate agent who didn't ask questions. And then he locked the door behind him and threw away the key. And then he waited. He waited for the guilt to fade. It didn't. If anything, it got worse. The guilt was a constant companion, whispering to him in the dark, reminding him of every person he'd disappointed, every opportunity he'd abandoned, every dream he'd destroyed. He waited for the loneliness to become bearable, for his mind to adjust to the silence, for his body to stop aching with the weight of isolation. Instead, it got worse. Day after day, the loneliness grew sharper. More cutting, more unbearable. It was like living inside a pressure cooker, and the pressure just kept building and building with no release valve. He waited for some reason to go back, some spark of hope that would pull him back to civilization, back to people, back to life. He waited for that moment where he'd wake up and realize he'd made a terrible mistake. That moment never came. Instead, day after day blurred into the next in an endless, suffocating blur. And Marcus realized something absolutely terrifying. He wasn't just isolated anymore. He was disappearing. Not physically. His body was still there, still technically breathing, still moving through the motions of survival like a ghost. But the part of him that was actually alive, the part that felt things, that wanted things, that believed in things. That part was gone, erased, dead. The cabin became his prison and his sanctuary all at once. 4 walls that seemed to close in on him more with each passing day. A fireplace that he kept burning just to feel something, just to watch the flames flicker and dance and pretend they meant something. A bed he barely slept in because sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant remembering what he'd left behind. Windows that looked out onto endless forest, endless trees, endless emptiness, endless nothing. The view never changed. It was always the same. Always trees, always silence, always the crushing weight of his own isolation. And the silence, God, the silence was deafening. It was so complete, so total, so overwhelming, that it started to feel like a living thing. Like it was a presence in the cabin with him, a breathing, watching, waiting. Like it was crushing him slowly, day by day, breath by breath, squeezing the life out of him in the most methodical, patient way possible. Some days he'd scream just to hear a sound, just to prove that he still existed, that he could still make an impact on the world around him. But even his screams seemed to get swallowed by the silence, absorbed into the endless void. By day 100, he'd stopped trying to pretend he was going to go back. He'd stopped updating his resume, stopped checking his email, stopped looking at old photos of his life before. By day 250, he'd stopped counting the days. What was the point? Time had lost all meaning. One day was exactly like the last, and the next day would be exactly the same. By day 520, he'd stopped believing there was any reason to keep going at all. He wasn't suicidal, exactly. He wasn't making any active plans to end things. He just didn't care anymore. He'd stopped eating regularly. Sometimes he'd go 2-3 days without food and not even notice. Stopped maintaining the cabin. The roof had started to leak in places. The walls were getting moldy. The whole place was slowly rotting around him, and he didn't have the energy to stop it. Stopped doing anything that suggested he believed in a future. He was just existing. Just taking up space, just waiting. Waiting for winter to come and finish what his own despair had started. Waiting for the cold to seep into his bones and finally, mercifully, put him out of his misery. Waiting for the end. He'd become a ghost haunting his own life. And then, on the night of day 520, everything changed. Everything. But what he didn't know was that his entire life was about to be shattered by the smallest, most unexpected, most powerful force imaginable. And that force was about to teach him what it really meant to live. The sound came at 3:47 in the morning. Marcus knew the exact time because he'd been staring at the ceiling for hours, doing what he always did, nothing. Just lying there in the darkness, doing what he'd become an expert at, existing without living. His eyes were open but unseeing. His mind was a wasteland, empty, numb, dead. The kind of dead that doesn't even hurt anymore because you've been dead so long that pain feels like a distant memory from someone else's life. He'd stopped counting the minutes a long time ago, but old habits die hard. He still glanced at the clock sometimes, still marked the passage of time even though time meant nothing to him anymore. Hours blended into days, days blended into months, months blended into an endless, suffocating blur of sameness. And here he was, at 3:47 in the morning, staring at nothing, thinking about nothing, feeling nothing. And then he heard it. A sound so small, so fragile, so utterly out of place in the endless silence of the forest that at first Marcus thought he'd imagined it. A whimper, a cry, something desperate and dying, piercing through the darkness like a needle through fabric, like a scream cutting through a funeral. He sat up in bed, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. The first real feeling he'd had in months. A genuine, physical response to something outside himself. For a moment, he just sat there in the darkness, listening, waiting, wondering if he was finally losing his mind. Wondering if the isolation had finally broken something fundamental inside him. But no, the sound was real. He could hear it. It was outside the cabin, somewhere in the frozen night, calling out to the darkness like a prayer nobody would answer. There it was again. Closer this time, weaker, more desperate, more anguished. The kind of sound that an animal makes when it knows it's dying. When it's calling out for help it knows will never come. When it's screaming into the void and hoping that someone, anyone, will hear it and care enough to respond. Something outside the cabin was dying. Something was out there in the cold, suffering, alone, abandoned. Just like him. Marcus didn't think. For the first time in 520 days, he didn't analyze the situation, didn't weigh the pros and cons, didn't retreat into his own mind where it was safe and numb and predictable. He just moved. His body acted on instinct, on something primal that lived deeper than thought. He threw off the thin blanket he'd been lying under, pulled on his boots with shaking hands, grabbed his heavy winter coat from the hook by the door, found his flashlight on the shelf. And then he walked out into the freezing night without even pausing to consider what he was doing. The snow was falling thick and heavy, coming down in enormous flakes that seemed to swallow the beam of his flashlight. The wind was brutal, cutting through his coat like it wasn't even there, like his body was made of paper. The temperature had to be well below zero, probably closer to 20 or 30 below. The kind of cold that kills you if you're not careful, that doesn't care about your intentions or your will to survive. The kind of cold that is patient and methodical and absolutely unforgiving. The kind of cold that stops your heart and freezes your blood and turns your skin to ice from the inside out. But Marcus barely noticed. He was focused on the sound, following it, listening for it through the howling wind. His flashlight beam danced across the snow, illuminating nothing but the white, endless white. The whole world reduced to white and black, and the narrow beam of his light. Behind the cabin, near the tree line where the forest began its dark march into the wilderness, he found her. A baby lynx, barely bigger than a kitten, maybe 4 or 5 months old at most. Matted fur that was caked with ice and dirt and blood. Shaking violently, her whole body convulsing with cold and pain and fear. One of her back legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, the bone possibly protruding through the skin. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, the eyes of something that was already halfway gone, something that had already started its journey to the other side. And she was infected. Marcus could see it immediately, could smell it in the air, the sickly sweet stench of decay and rot. Her fur was patchy in places where the infection had eaten away at her skin, leaving raw, open wounds that were weeping pus and blood. Her breathing was shallow and labored, like each breath was a battle she was losing, like her lungs were filling with fluid, like she was drowning in slow motion. She was dying, right here, right now, in front of him, in the freezing cold, alone, abandoned. And there was nothing he could do about it, nothing that would make any difference. She was too far gone. She was suffering too much. The merciful thing would be to leave her here, to let the cold and the infection and the darkness take her quickly. But when Marcus knelt down in the snow, his knees sinking into the white powder, his body already shaking with cold, something inside him broke open. Not sadness exactly, not quite. It was something deeper than that, something primal, something that had been buried so deep inside him that he'd forgotten it even existed. A recognition of suffering, a mirror held up to his own dying soul. This creature was alone, just like him. This creature was suffering, just like him. This creature was at the end of its rope, abandoned by the world, with no one to care whether it lived or died. Just like him. For a moment, Marcus saw himself in those glassy eyes. He saw his own desperation, his own pain, his own slow descent into darkness. And something shifted. Something fundamental changed in that moment. Because if he could save this creature, if he could pull this one small life back from the brink of death, then maybe, just maybe, his own life wasn't completely worthless. Maybe there was still some purpose to his existence. Maybe there was still some reason to keep going. He could have left her there. Could have gone back inside the cabin, back to his bed, back to his numbness and his silence and his slow, methodical dying. It would have been the logical thing to do. She was a wild animal. She was infected. She was suffering. The merciful thing would be to let her go, to let the cold and the infection and the darkness take her. It would be over quickly. It would be kind. It would be the right thing to do. But Marcus didn't go back inside. Instead, he picked her up, carefully, so carefully, trying not to hurt her broken leg any more than it was already hurt, trying to support her body in a way that wouldn't cause her additional pain. She weighed almost nothing, just skin and bone and matted fur. She felt fragile, like she might fall apart in his hands. He cradled her against his chest, feeling her heartbeat against his own, feeling her trembling with cold and fear. And he carried her into the cabin, carried her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Because in that moment, to Marcus, she was. He laid her down on the kitchen table, and he looked at her, really looked at her, studying every inch of her body, assessing the damage, trying to figure out what he could do to help her. And he made a decision that would change everything. A decision that would alter the entire trajectory of his life. A decision that would pull him back from the edge of the abyss and give him something to live for. He was going to save her life. He didn't know if he could. He didn't know if she was too far gone, if the infection had already spread too far into her system, if her body had already given up on the fight. He didn't know if she would even survive the night, if her heart would keep beating, if her lungs would keep breathing. He didn't have any medical training. He didn't have proper supplies. He didn't have anything except his own desperate determination and a will to keep this creature alive that surprised him with its intensity. But he was going to try. He was going to fight for this creature with everything he had left inside him. Marcus spent the next 6 hours in a fever of activity. The most energy he'd expended in months, maybe in years. Energy he didn't know he still had. He boiled water on the stove, watching it steam and bubble, grateful for the heat and the sound and the sense of purpose. He found old cloth in a drawer and tore it into strips, working methodically, his hands moving with surprising precision. He carefully cleaned the infection from her fur, working as gently as he could, whispering to her in a voice he barely recognized as his own. A voice that was soft and tender and full of something that felt dangerously close to hope. He set her broken leg as best he could, working carefully, trying not to hurt her, trying to align the bone as close to its natural position as possible. He splinted it with sticks and cloth, fashioning a makeshift cast that would keep the leg immobilized while it healed. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if he was doing it right. But he was doing something. He was taking action. He was fighting. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, he'd done everything he could think of to do. Whether it would be enough, he had no idea. Whether she would survive, whether the infection would spread, whether his efforts would matter at all. He couldn't know any of that. All he knew was that he'd tried. He'd fought for her. He'd refused to let her die without a struggle. He sat beside her on the kitchen floor as the sun came up, painting the snow outside in shades of gold and pink and amber. The lynx was still breathing, still alive. Her eyes had closed, but they were moving beneath her eyelids. She was dreaming. And Marcus realized something that made his chest tighten, that made something inside him shift and change and come back to life. He cared whether she lived or died. He cared. For the first time in 520 days, he cared about something other than his own pain. He cared about this creature's survival. He cared about her future. He cared about whether she would make it through the night. He cared, and that changed everything. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't just any lynx. She wasn't just a random animal that had stumbled onto his cabin by accident. She was running from something far worse than starvation. She was running from something that was hunting her, something dangerous, something that would follow her and him into the darkness. And everything was about to get infinitely more complicated. Everything was about to become a fight for survival in ways Marcus couldn't even imagine. 3 days passed. 3 days of watching, waiting, praying that the lynx would survive. 3 days of wondering if he was wasting his time, if his efforts were futile, if he should have just let her die in the snow where he found her. 3 days that felt like 3 years. 3 days that felt like 3 seconds. Time had become elastic, unpredictable, meaningless. Marcus had named her Aria, a name that meant air or melody. Because despite everything, despite her injuries and her infection and her proximity to death, she had a kind of grace about her, a lightness, like she was made of music and starlight instead of flesh and bone. Like there was something almost ethereal about her presence, something that transcended the physical reality of her suffering. The first night, he wasn't sure she'd make it to morning. Her fever spiked dangerously high, her body burning with infection, her small frame convulsing with chills and heat, and the internal battle between her immune system and the bacteria ravaging her wounds. Her breathing became more and more labored, each breath a struggle, each exhalation a whisper that might be her last. Marcus sat beside her through the entire night, not sleeping, not even trying to sleep. He changed the cloth on her wounds every hour, keeping them clean, keeping them as sterile as possible with the limited supplies he had. He whispered to her, told her stories, willed her to survive with every fiber of his being. He told her about his old life, about the deals he'd made, the million-dollar contracts he'd negotiated, the investors he'd impressed with his vision and his charisma and his absolute certainty that he was destined for greatness. He told her about the penthouse apartment and the expensive cars and the designer clothes and all the material possessions that he'd thought would fill the void inside him. He told her about the parties where he'd stood in rooms full of people and felt completely, utterly alone. And as he told these stories, sitting in the darkness of the cabin, his hand resting gently on Aria's small body, he realized how hollow they all sounded, how meaningless, how empty of any real substance or value. What good were $1 million deals if you were dead inside? What good was success if you had no one to share it with? What good was all the money in the world if it couldn't buy you a single moment of genuine connection, genuine happiness, genuine peace? By morning, the fever had broken. Aria was still alive. Her breathing was still shallow, still labored, but it was steadier now, more rhythmic, more hopeful. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The second day, she opened her eyes for the first time. Just for a moment. Just a crack, like she was peeking out at the world, testing whether it was safe to fully wake up. But it was enough. Marcus saw consciousness there. Awareness. A spark of life that hadn't been extinguished. A will to survive that burned despite everything working against her. He gave her water, dripping it slowly onto her tongue from a cloth, watching her swallow with obvious difficulty. Watching her fight. Watching her refuse to die. He sat beside her for hours, just watching her sleep, marveling at the fact that she was still breathing, still fighting, still holding on. He found himself talking to her, telling her things he'd never told anyone. Things about his fears, his doubts, his absolute certainty that he'd made a terrible mistake by leaving his old life. Things about the loneliness that had consumed him, the silence that had nearly driven him mad, the slow erosion of his will to live. "Don't give up," he whispered to her, and he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. "Please don't give up. We're going to make it through this. Both of us. I promise." The second night, she ate. Just a little bit of fish that Marcus had caught from the frozen stream behind the cabin, using a method he'd learned years ago and had almost forgotten. He'd broken through the ice, set a trap, waited patiently. And when the fish came, he'd caught it with his bare hands, something he hadn't done since he was a child. Just a few bites of the raw fish. But it was something. It was progress. It was a sign that her body was ready to accept nourishment, that she was fighting to survive, that she believed, on some level, that survival was possible. By the third day, Arya was sleeping more peacefully. The infection seemed to be stabilizing, the swelling in her wounds reducing, the angry red color fading to a more natural pink. Her breathing was stronger, deeper, more regular. Her eyes were clearer when she opened them, more focused, more present. She was still weak, still injured, still a long way from full recovery. But she was going to make it. Marcus could feel it in his bones. She was going to live. And he realized something that shocked him with its intensity. He wanted her to live. Not just intellectually, not just as an abstract concept, but with every fiber of his being. He wanted this small creature to survive and thrive and grow strong. He wanted to see her run through the forest on 4 healthy legs. He wanted to know that his efforts had mattered, that he'd made a difference in the world, that he'd saved a life. For the first time in 520 days, Marcus wanted something, truly wanted it. And that wanting, that desire, that spark of purpose, it changed something fundamental inside him. By the evening of the third day, Arya was resting comfortably on the kitchen table, her breathing steady and even, her body finally beginning to heal. Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment, a sense of pride, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right. Maybe he'd finally done something that mattered. And then, at approximately 6:47 in the evening, everything changed. Marcus was outside, gathering firewood from the pile near the cabin, his arms full of logs and branches, his mind drifting to thoughts of dinner, of sleep, of the peaceful routine that had begun to form over the past 3 days. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep crimson. The snow was glowing in the fading light, almost luminescent, almost beautiful. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel something close to contentment. And then he heard it. A sound that made his blood run cold. A sound that belonged to the forest, but was wrong somehow. Wrong in a way that triggered something ancient and primal in his brain. A warning system that had been dormant for so long that he'd almost forgotten it existed. a survival instinct that predated civilization, predated thought, predated everything except the most basic imperative. Stay alive. A growl. Low. Guttural. Filled with hunger and rage and predatory intent. The kind of sound that comes from deep in the chest of something that kills for a living. Something that has no mercy, no compassion, no hesitation. Marcus spun around, his arms full of firewood. And that's when he saw it. Emerging from the tree line like a nightmare made flesh. A cougar, a mountain lion, a puma. One of the largest he'd ever seen. Easily 200 pounds of muscle and claw and fang. Its coat was a tawny brown, almost golden in the fading light, rippling with each movement of its powerful body. Its eyes were fixed on the cabin. On him. And those eyes held an intelligence that was almost more terrifying than the physical threat. These weren't the eyes of a simple animal acting on instinct. These were the eyes of a hunter, a strategist, a predator that understood tactics and patience and the long game. This wasn't just an animal. This was a hunter. This was a predator that had been tracking something. This was something that had purpose and determination and an absolute, unwavering commitment to its goal. And Marcus suddenly understood with perfect clarity. It had been tracking Arya. The cougar took a step forward, its massive paws silent on the snow, its muscles tensing, its tail lashing back and forth in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was assessing him, deciding whether he was a threat or an obstacle, deciding whether it should attack now or wait for a better opportunity, deciding how to proceed with maximum efficiency and minimum risk to itself. Another step, closer now. Close enough that Marcus could see the scars on the cougar's body. Old wounds. Battles won. Prey caught and killed. This was a survivor. This was an apex predator that had earned its position at the top of the food chain through violence and cunning and relentless determination. The cougar's lips pulled back, revealing teeth like ivory daggers. Its growl deepened, became more intense, more threatening. A sound that said, "I am death. I am hunger. I am coming for what is mine." Marcus didn't think. Thinking was a luxury he couldn't afford. He dropped the firewood and ran for the cabin door, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. Behind him, he could hear the cougar's heavy footfalls, could hear the sound of its breathing, could feel the weight of its predatory focus like a physical force pushing against his back, like invisible claws reaching for him, trying to drag him down. He reached the door, yanked it open with shaking hands, and threw himself inside, slamming it shut just as the cougar's massive body crashed against the wood with a force that was absolutely terrifying. The impact was tremendous, like being hit by a truck, like the entire cabin shook on its foundations. The whole structure seemed to vibrate with the force of it, the walls groaning, the windows rattling in their frames. And then the cougar did something that made Marcus's heart stop completely. It began to claw at the door. Long, deliberate scratches, gouging deep into the wood, working methodically, patiently, like it had all the time in the world. Like it wasn't in any hurry. Like it knew, with absolute certainty, that eventually it would get what it wanted. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Each sound was like fingernails on a chalkboard, like nails being driven into his skull, like the sound of his own death approaching one scratch at a time. The cougar's claws were leaving deep gouges in the wood, splinters flying, the door beginning to deteriorate under the relentless assault. Because it did have all the time in the world. It was a predator. It could wait. It could hunt. It could work through the night if necessary. It had nothing but time and hunger, and the absolute certainty that eventually it would get what it wanted. It had probably been tracking Arya for days. It had probably been following her scent through the snow, through the forest, across miles and miles of wilderness. And now that it had found her, now that it knew where she was, it wasn't going to give up. It was going to get her, no matter what it took, no matter what stood in its way. Marcus backed away from the door, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps, his hands shaking, his mind racing, trying to think, trying to figure out what to do. The cabin suddenly felt very small, very fragile, very temporary. The walls were old wood, weathered and worn by decades of snow and wind and cold. The door was old wood, barely holding together. The windows were just glass, easily broken. If the cougar wanted to get in, it could. It was just a matter of time and persistence, and the cougar's absolute commitment to its goal. He looked at Arya, still lying on the kitchen table, watching him with those intelligent eyes. Understanding, somehow, that the hunter had come for her. That this was the thing she'd been running from. That this was the predator that had driven her into the snow and the cold and the darkness. That this was the reason she'd been dying in the forest when Marcus found her. The cougar's claws continued their methodical work on the door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Each sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, each sound a reminder of how thin the line was between safety and death, between inside and outside, between life and the abyss, between civilization and the raw, primal forces of nature that didn't care about morality or fairness or the value of a single human life. Marcus moved quickly, his mind shifting into a mode he didn't know he still possessed. Survival mode. A mode that had been dormant for 520 days, but was now fully awakened, fully activated, running on pure adrenaline and the primal will to survive. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer, a large hunting knife with a blade that was maybe 8 inches long, sharp and well-maintained. One of the few things he'd taken care of in the cabin. Not much of a weapon against a 200-pound predator, but it was something. It was better than nothing. It was a tool. It was a chance. He moved to the window and peered out into the gathering darkness. The cougar was still focused on the door, still clawing, still working with patient, methodical determination. But Marcus could see something else now. A wound on the cougar's left flank. A deep gash that was bleeding, that looked infected, that looked like it was causing the cougar pain. The cougar was hurt. Not badly, but hurt enough that it was moving with a slight limp. Hurt enough that it was vulnerable. Hurt enough that a desperate man with a knife might have a chance. And suddenly, Marcus understood the full picture. Arya hadn't just stumbled onto his cabin by accident. She'd been running from this cougar. This hunter had caught her, had injured her, had left her for dead. And somehow, through some miracle of survival instinct and sheer determination and the absolute refusal to accept defeat, she'd managed to escape. She'd run through the snow and the cold and the darkness, dragging her broken leg, fighting through the infection, until she'd found shelter. Until she'd found him. The cougar had followed her scent, had tracked her through the snow like a bloodhound, following the trail of her desperation, had found the cabin. And now it was here, determined to finish what it had started, determined to reclaim its prey, determined to complete the kill. Marcus looked at the knife in his hand. Then he looked at Arya, lying on the kitchen table, watching him with those intelligent eyes, understanding somehow that her fate depended on what he did in the next few moments. Then he looked at the door, which was starting to splinter under the cougar's relentless assault. The wood beginning to give way, the hinges straining. He made a decision that would either save both their lives or end them both. A decision that would require him to step outside the safety of the cabin and face the predator head-on. A decision that would put him directly in the path of death and hope that he could somehow overcome it. He moved to the door, took a deep breath, and prepared himself for what was about to happen. He thought about his old life, about the deals and the money, and the success that had meant nothing. He thought about the 520 days of isolation and numbness and slow dying. He thought about Arya and how she'd given him something to live for. He thought about how, if he was going to die, at least it would be for something that mattered. And then he opened the door. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't just about survival. This wasn't just about two creatures fighting over a third. This wasn't just about a man with a knife facing a predator in the snow. This was about something much larger. Something that had been set in motion long before Arya had stumbled onto his cabin. Something that would reveal truths about the forest, about the mountain, about the very nature of the world he thought he understood. Something that would change everything. And Marcus was about to discover that the real danger wasn't the cougar at all. The cougar was just the beginning. The cougar was just the first wave. The real threat was something far more sinister, far more powerful, far more terrifying than any animal that walked on four legs. The cold air hit Marcus like a physical blow as he stepped outside. The knife gripped tightly in his hand, his breath coming in white clouds that dissipated into the darkness. The snow crunched beneath his feet, each step announcing his presence, each movement a declaration of intent. Behind him, the cabin door swung open, and he could feel the warmth escaping, the refuge he'd built disappearing behind him as he moved forward into the frozen night. The cougar was waiting. It stood about 20 feet away, its massive body silhouetted against the darkening sky, its eyes reflecting the last rays of the setting sun like two burning coals. The wound on its flank was more visible now, more severe than Marcus had initially thought. Blood matted the fur around the gash, and the cougar's breathing was slightly labored, slightly heavier than it should have been. But that made it more dangerous, not less. An injured predator was unpredictable. An injured predator had nothing to lose. For a moment, neither of them moved. Marcus and the cougar, man and beast. Predator and prey, though it was unclear which was which. The wind howled around them, carrying the scent of blood and fear and the ancient dance of survival that had played out in these mountains for millennia. The cougar's ears flattened against its head. Its lips pulled back further, revealing more of those terrible teeth. A low rumble emanated from deep within its chest, a sound that was almost like a purr. Except there was nothing comforting about it. This was the sound of a predator that had made a decision. This was the sound of commitment. This was the sound of death approaching. Marcus raised the knife, holding it in front of him, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. The blade looked pathetically small compared to the cougar's size, compared to its claws and its teeth and its raw physical power. But it was all he had. It was all he could offer in the face of this impossible situation. "Come on," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Come on, you bastard. Let's finish this." The cougar took a step forward, then another. Its injured leg was definitely bothering it, but it moved with the fluid grace of a creature that had been perfected by millions of years of evolution. Every muscle, every movement, every breath was optimized for one purpose: the kill. Marcus didn't wait for the cougar to attack. He couldn't afford to be passive, couldn't afford to react. He had to act. He had to take the initiative. He lunged forward, the knife raised, aiming for the cougar's injured flank, trying to exploit the weakness he'd identified. The cougar moved with incredible speed, faster than something so large should be able to move. It twisted its body, avoiding the knife by inches, and lashed out with one massive paw. Marcus felt the claws rake across his shoulder, tearing through his jacket and into the flesh beneath. Pain exploded through his body, white-hot and searing, but he ignored it. He had to ignore it. Pain was a distraction he couldn't afford. He spun around, bringing the knife up, and the cougar met him again. This time, they were closer, locked in a desperate dance where one mistake meant death. Marcus could smell the cougar now, the musk of its body, the copper scent of its blood, the primal animal smell of something that had never known civilization, never known mercy, never known anything but the hunt. The cougar lunged for his throat, its jaws opening wide, its teeth gleaming in the twilight. Marcus threw up his arm, and the cougar's teeth closed on his forearm instead of his neck. The pain was indescribable. It was like having his arm caught in a vise made of daggers. But Marcus didn't scream. He didn't hesitate. He brought the knife down hard, driving it deep into the cougar's shoulder, feeling the blade sink into muscle and bone. The cougar released him with a roar that echoed through the forest, a sound of pain and rage and wounded pride. Blood poured from the wound Marcus had inflicted, mixing with the snow, turning the white ground red. The cougar backed away, its breathing heavy now, its movements less fluid, less confident. Marcus was bleeding too. His arm was torn where the cougar's teeth had pierced it. His shoulder was shredded, his body was screaming with pain. But he was still standing. He was still fighting. He was still alive. The cougar crouched, gathering itself for another attack. But something had changed. The initial confidence was gone. The cougar was injured now, badly injured. It was no longer the apex predator facing an easy kill. It was a wounded animal facing an opponent that refused to die. They circled each other, both bleeding, both breathing hard, both locked in a primal struggle that transcended civilization and thought and reason. This was pure survival. This was the raw, ancient dance of predator and prey, played out in the snow with a knife and teeth and claws. The cougar attacked again, but this time Marcus was ready. He sidestepped, letting the momentum carry the massive body past him, and as it passed, he drove the knife upward, aiming for the ribs, aiming for the organs that kept it alive. The blade found its mark, sinking deep, and the cougar's roar became a scream of pain and fury. It spun around, and for a moment, Marcus thought it was going to come at him again. But the cougar's movements were slower now, more labored. The wounds were taking their toll. The blood loss was adding up. The cougar was dying, and it knew it. For a long moment, they stared at each other, man and beast, both wounded, both desperate, both fighting for survival. And then, with a sound that was almost like a sigh, the cougar turned and limped back toward the forest. It moved slowly, painfully, each step an obvious effort. It was giving up. It was retreating. It was accepting that this prey was not worth the cost. Marcus watched it disappear into the darkness, watched until he could no longer hear the sound of its movement, watched until he was certain it was gone. And then his knees buckled, and he fell to the snow, his knife falling from his nerveless fingers. He lay there for a long time, bleeding into the snow, his body screaming with pain, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He'd fought a cougar. He'd fought a 200-pound predator with nothing but a knife and desperation and the will to survive. And he'd won. He'd won. After a long time, Marcus had no idea how long, minutes or hours, time had become meaningless again. He forced himself to his feet. His arm was badly wounded, and he was losing blood. He needed to get inside. He needed to tend to his wounds. He needed to survive. He staggered back to the cabin, leaving a trail of blood in the snow behind him. When he got inside, he saw Arya, still on the kitchen table, watching him with those intelligent eyes. And he realized something that made him laugh, a sound that was half sob, half hysteria. She'd been waiting for him. She'd known he would come back. She'd known he would survive. He collapsed into a chair, and that's when the shock hit him. His body began to shake uncontrollably, his teeth chattering, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. He'd been cut badly. The cougar's teeth had torn deep into his forearm, and the wound was bleeding heavily. He needed to stop the bleeding. He needed to clean the wounds. He needed to do something, or he was going to bleed out right here in this cabin, having survived the cougar only to die from his own injuries. With shaking hands, Marcus gathered cloth and water. He cleaned the wounds as best he could, gritting his teeth against the pain. He wrapped his arm tightly, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. He cleaned the gashes on his shoulder, wrapped them as well. By the time he was finished, he was pale and weak and barely conscious. But he was alive. He looked at Arya, still watching him from the table, and he managed a weak smile. "We made it," he whispered. "We both made it." And as consciousness began to slip away from him, as the shock and blood loss pulled him toward the darkness, Marcus realized something profound. He didn't want to die. For the first time in 520 days, he genuinely, truly wanted to live. Not because he was afraid of death, but because he had something to live for. He had Arya. He had purpose. He had meaning. And as the darkness claimed him, as he fell into unconsciousness on the kitchen floor of his remote cabin, Marcus held on to that thought like a lifeline. He would survive this. He would heal. He and Arya would both make it through the night, and tomorrow they would begin the long process of truly living, of rebuilding, of finding their way back to the world. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he lay bleeding on the kitchen floor, was that the cougar had not acted alone. It had not come to the cabin by accident or by simple predatory instinct. It had been sent, directed, controlled by something far more intelligent, far more sinister, far more powerful than any animal. And the real danger, the true threat, was only just beginning. The cougar had been merely the first test, the first probe, the first move in a game that had stakes far higher than Marcus could possibly imagine. And when he woke up, when he recovered from his wounds, the real horror would begin. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, trapped in a liminal space between life and death, between reality and nightmare. Time lost all meaning. Hours became minutes. Minutes became hours. The cabin seemed to shift and change around him, the walls breathing, the shadows dancing in the corners of his vision like living things with their own thoughts and intentions. He was aware, on some level, that he was lying on the kitchen floor. He was aware of the cold seeping up through the wood, the way his body was shaking with fever, the way his wounds throbbed with a pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He was aware of Arya, still on the table above him, watching him with those intelligent eyes, as if she was monitoring his condition, as if she was willing him to survive through sheer force of her presence. But most of what he experienced was fever dream, hallucination, the product of a mind that was burning up with infection, that was struggling to process the trauma of the fight, that was teetering on the edge of sepsis and death. He saw his old office, the penthouse suite on the 42nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He was sitting at his desk, and across from him was a man he didn't recognize. The man had a face that kept shifting, changing, never quite settling into a fixed form. And the man was talking, saying something important, something that Marcus needed to understand. But the words kept slipping away, dissolving like smoke before they could fully form. "You made a choice," the man said, his voice echoing strangely. "You chose this. You chose to leave. You chose to die." "No," Marcus tried to say, but his voice wouldn't work. His throat was closed, his tongue was swollen, his mouth was dry as bone. "Yes," the man continued, leaning forward. "You chose isolation. You chose numbness. You chose to stop living. And now you're paying the price." The office dissolved, and Marcus was back in the forest. But it wasn't the forest as it actually was. It was a twisted, distorted version of the forest, where the trees were impossibly tall, stretching up into a sky that was the color of old blood. The snow on the ground was red, not white, and it was warm to the touch, like it was made of blood instead of frozen water. And moving through this nightmare forest were shapes, shadows, things that didn't quite have form but were definitely present, definitely aware, definitely hunting. They moved with purpose and intelligence, communicating with each other through sounds that were almost like language, but not quite. Almost like thought, but not quite. One of the shapes came closer, and Marcus saw that it was the cougar. But it was wrong. Its eyes were wrong. They held an intelligence that no animal should possess, an intelligence that was almost human, but not quite. An intelligence that was older than human, deeper than human, more primal than human. "We sent her to you," the cougar said. And its voice was the sound of wind through dead leaves, the sound of ice cracking, the sound of things breaking and falling apart. "We sent her as a test, and you passed. You protected her. You fought for her. You chose life over death." "Who are you?" Marcus tried to ask. But again, his voice wouldn't work. "We are what remains," the cougar said. "We are what has always been here, in the mountains, in the forest, in the places where humanity has not yet reached. We are the old things, the forgotten things, the things that remember when this land was ours and ours alone." The cougar moved closer, and Marcus could see that it was bleeding, that the wounds he'd inflicted were still open, still fresh. But the cougar didn't seem to care about the pain. It was beyond pain. It was beyond the concerns of a mere physical body. "Arya is one of us," the cougar continued. "But she is also something else. She is a bridge, a connection between the old world and the new world. And you have been chosen to help her, to protect her, to guide her to the place where she needs to be." "Why me?" Marcus whispered. And this time his voice worked, though it sounded strange and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Because you were dying," the cougar said. "Because you had given up on life. Because you were hollow and empty and ready to embrace the darkness. We needed someone like that. Someone who had nothing to lose. Someone who could be reborn." The forest dissolved again, and Marcus was back in the cabin. But everything was different now. The walls were transparent, and he could see through them to the forest beyond. And in the forest, he could see them. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. Shapes moving through the darkness, communicating silently with each other, watching the cabin, watching him, waiting for something. Arya was standing beside him now. She was no longer injured. Her broken leg was healed. Her wounds were gone. She was whole and perfect and impossibly beautiful. And she was looking at him with those intelligent eyes. And he understood somehow that she was trying to tell him something. something important, something that would change everything. "The sickness is coming," she said, and her voice was like the sound of wind chimes, like the sound of distant bells, like the sound of something that existed between the physical world and something else entirely. The sickness that took our kind, the sickness that is spreading through the world, and you have been chosen to help us stop it. "I don't understand," Marcus said. "You will," Arya replied. "When you wake up, you will understand. But first, you must survive. First, you must heal. First, you must become something more than you were." The fever intensified, and Marcus felt like his body was being consumed from the inside by fire. His skin was burning, his bones were aching, his blood felt like it was boiling in his veins. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped in this burning body, trapped in this fever dream, trapped between life and death and something else entirely. And then, in the darkness, he heard a voice that was familiar and strange at the same time, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Hold on," the voice said. "Just hold on a little longer. You're almost through this. You're almost to the other side." And somehow, Marcus knew that the voice was right. Somehow, he knew that if he could just hold on, if he could just survive this fever, this infection, this darkness, then everything would change. Everything would be revealed. Everything would make sense. So he held on. He clung to consciousness like a drowning man, clinging to driftwood. He fought against the fever, against the infection, against the pull of the darkness. And slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the fever began to break. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time had lost all meaning. But eventually, Marcus became aware that the fever was receding. His skin was still hot, but it was no longer burning. His body was still aching, but the pain was becoming more manageable, more bearable. His mind was becoming clearer, more focused, more present in the physical world. And when he finally opened his eyes fully, when he finally emerged from the fever dream and returned to the waking world, Marcus saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Arya was standing on the kitchen floor, on her 4 legs, walking, moving, completely healed. The broken leg was whole, the wounds were gone, the infection was vanished. She was perfect. She was whole. She was alive in a way that seemed almost impossible given where she'd started. And she was looking at him with those intelligent eyes, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that everything he'd experienced in the fever dream had been real. Or at least, real in some way that transcended the normal definitions of reality. Real in a way that mattered. Real in a way that changed everything. Arya walked over to him, and she nuzzled her head against his chest. And Marcus felt something break open inside him. Something that had been closed and locked away for 520 days. Something that had been dead and was now coming back to life. He wrapped his arms around her, and he wept. Not tears of sadness, but tears of release. Tears of transformation. Tears of being reborn. "What are you?" he whispered into her fur. And Arya looked up at him. And in her eyes, he saw the answer. Not in words, but in images, in visions, in knowledge that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and go directly into his soul. She was the bridge. She was the connection between worlds. She was the beginning of something new. And he was the one who had been chosen to help her. But what neither of them knew was that the sickness Arya had spoken of in the fever dream was already spreading. It was moving through the mountains, moving through the forest, moving towards civilization. And when it arrived, When it reached the cities and the towns and the places where millions of people lived, the world would change forever. The old order would collapse, the new world would be born, and Marcus and Arya would find themselves at the center of an apocalypse that would redefine what it meant to be human.